Min-sok sat on the floor outside room 42, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest like a kid waiting to get picked up from school. Nurses stepped around him without slowing down. One of them, older, with a clipboard pressed to her chest, looked at him for half a second, and then kept walking. Down the hall, a vending machine hummed against the quiet. Somewhere behind a closed door, a monitor beeped on a steady, unhurried rhythm. He'd called 4 numbers that night. 3 rang out. The 4th picked up on the 2nd ring, got dressed in the dark, and drove 11 miles over the speed limit to a hospital where the front desk wouldn't say a room number without the right last name. Scarlett Bennett had one rule that mattered more than any other in 3 years with this man. He didn't call her about family. There was no family to call about. He'd told her that the first month they were together, his wife was gone, 2 years gone, a car on a wet road outside Daegu. That's why this could exist between them at all. That's the whole reason there was a them. She crouched down in front of him in the hallway. He didn't look up. Min-sok. Nothing. Who's in there? A security guard by the nurse's station watched the two of them a beat too long, then turned his head fast, like he'd caught something he wasn't supposed to see. Min-sok's hands sat flat on his knees, perfectly still. "My wife," he said. Scarlett didn't say anything back. 3 years, and that word had never once belonged to a living person in any sentence between them. "My beautiful story lovers, before we dive any deeper, can I steal a quick second? If you're already hooked, drop a comment and tell me what's going through your mind. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I genuinely love hearing from you. And yes, I'll be reading every single comment." 3 years earlier, none of this had a name yet. Scarlett met him in a glass conference room on the 9th floor of a building she'd been hired to audit, not date. She worked compliance and forensic accounting, the kind of job where people got nervous when she pulled up a chair. Pack Construction and Marine had failed a routine Port Authority review 6 months earlier, and her firm got the contract to clean up the paperwork before regulators came back for a second look. Min-sok sat in on the first meeting because his name was on the org chart. He stayed after the meeting to ask her one question about a line item. It wasn't really about the line item. She didn't fall for him fast. That wasn't how she worked. She noticed things instead, how he flinched a little whenever someone mentioned his family by name, how he ate lunch alone in a stairwell instead of the executive floor, how careful he was about which doors he walked through and when. A man hiding from something, she liked figuring out what. It took him 4 months to tell her about the wife who died. He didn't cry when he said it, which she noticed and filed away. He said it like a man reading directions off a box, flat, rehearsed, done before. She didn't push. She'd buried people too. She knew grief didn't always look like grief. What she didn't know was that he'd practiced that story on 3 women before her. The relationship ran on rules neither of them ever wrote down out loud. No photos together, no introducing her to anyone above a certain floor in the company. Separate apartments 4 miles apart, in 2 different parts of the city. When she asked, once, carefully, over wine, not pushing, about marriage, about a future with a shape to it, he said the same thing he always said. Not yet. She let it go, because the rest of it worked. He was attentive, in the specific way men are, when they're hiding something and overcompensating for it. He remembered things. He showed up. And her job kept her inside his family's financial records for 3 straight years, auditing subsidiary accounts, signing off on cleared paperwork, becoming, without either of them naming it, the only outside person who understood how that company actually moved its money. Nobody at Pack Construction questioned why the consultant and the heir got along so well. Nobody asked the obvious question, because the obvious question required someone to admit there was anything to hide. There was a night, about a year in, when he cooked for her in his apartment instead of taking her somewhere expensive, badly, burning the rice, laughing in a way she'd never once seen him laugh in a conference room. He didn't have anyone else in his life who got to see that version of him, the clumsy one, the one who swore under his breath in Korean when the smoke alarm went off. She remembered thinking, watching him wave a dish towel at the ceiling, that whatever this was, it had stopped being convenient a long time back. That was the part that made the rest of it bearable, the hiding, the rules. She told herself a man who burned rice for someone he was only using for access Wasn't the kind of man who needed to bother. She wasn't wrong about that exactly. She was just wrong about which parts of him were real and which parts were management. Once, early on, she found a second phone in his coat pocket while looking for her own. He explained it as a company line, kept separate for sensitive deals, required by his family's lawyers. She believed him because believing him was easier, and because nothing in his face that night gave her a reason not to. She filed it away the same way she filed away everything else that didn't quite add up, a habit she'd have plenty of time to regret later. He used to wait for her in the parking garage on nights she worked late, headlights off, sitting there until she came out, never making a thing of it. It was the kind of small, unglamorous loyalty that made 3 years feel like something worth protecting, even without a name for what it was. She used to tell herself that a man capable of that kind of patience couldn't also be capable of the kind of lying that ruins people. She was about to find out exactly how wrong that math could be. That arrangement held for 3 years. Then his phone rang at 11:40 on a Tuesday night, and he looked at the screen the way a man looks at a verdict he already knows is bad. Her own apartment was dark, except for the muted blue light of the TV she'd fallen asleep in front of, dishes from dinner still in the sink. The phone ringing on the coffee table cut through all of it. "Min Sok?" His voice came back thin and fast, nothing like the version of him she'd known for 3 years. "I need you at the hospital, the private wing on Garrison Street. Tell the desk you're with me. They'll have your name." "Tell me what's wrong." "I can't. Just come, please." The line went dead before she could ask anything else. She didn't turn on the lights getting dressed. Didn't need to. 3 years of late nights had taught her exactly where everything lived in the dark. She grabbed the first coat off the hook, found her keys by feel, and was in the car within 4 minutes. The kind of speed that comes from a body moving faster than a mind that hasn't caught up yet. She drove faster than she'd ever driven for him. Ran one yellow light that had clearly already turned red 2 seconds before her bumper crossed it. Her hands stayed locked at 10 and 2 the whole way, knuckles pale, gripping a wheel that had nothing to do with whatever was waiting for her on the other end of this drive. "Tell them you're with me," he'd said. Not "come meet me," not "I'll be outside." Wherever he was calling from, he was already there, which meant whatever was wrong had started before he ever picked up the phone. Possibly hours before. She'd been the 4th call, not the 1st, and he hadn't bothered mentioning who the other 3 were. She thought, driving, about the last time he'd gone this quiet on her. 6 months back, at a work dinner she'd dragged him to, where someone asked when they were finally going to make things official, and he'd answered for both of them before she could open her mouth. Not yet. He'd said it so easily that night, like a line he'd used before in a different version of this exact conversation. She'd let it go then, too. She pulled into a hospital lot she didn't recognize, not the one near his office, not the one near either of their apartments. A private wing, the kind with its own entrance and its own guard at a desk, who didn't ask for ID so much as expect it. "Bennett," she said, "I'm told my name should be on a list tonight." The guard checked, found it, and nodded, like he'd been told to expect exactly this. "Room 412, 4th floor." He buzzed her through a set of doors that required a code she didn't have, down a hallway quieter than any hospital hallway had a right to be. No overhead pages, no crash carts rolling past, just thick carpet and recessed lighting, and the particular hush of a place built to keep things from being seen. She rounded the last corner alone, with no idea what she was walking into, and found him already there, sitting on the floor outside a door marked 4th win 2, back against the wall, knees pulled to his chest, looking like a man who'd been sitting in that exact spot for longer than made sense. Scarlett stood over him for a second. 3 years of careful rules, of separate apartments and unlisted numbers, and a dead wife who apparently wasn't. And none of those rules had prepared her for what it looked like to watch this particular man come apart in a hospital hallway, alone, with no one beside him until she got there. She crouched down across from him. "Min Sok." He didn't look up. "Who's in there?" A nurse came out of a different room down the hall, said something low into a phone pressed to her shoulder, and Scarlett caught 4 words clean through the quiet. "Mrs. Park is stable. Mrs. Park." Past tense on a name that, 2 years ago, was supposed to belong to a dead woman. His hands sat flat on his knees, perfectly still. not crying. Past that. My wife, he said. Scarlett didn't say anything back. 3 years, and that word had never once belonged to a living person in any sentence between them. He said it again, quieter this time, like saying it twice might make it make sense to him too. My wife. Scarlett stood there a second longer than she meant to. Then she stepped past him toward the door. He grabbed her wrist. Not hard, just enough to stop her. Don't. Why not? He didn't have an answer for that one either. She pulled her hand free, not rough about it, and pushed the door open. The room was dim, machines running low and steady. One chair pulled close to the bed, and nobody sitting in it. A woman lay under a thin blanket, IV line taped to the back of one hand, dark hair spread out across the pillow, a small monitor clipped to one finger, blinking numbers nobody in the hallway seemed worried about anymore. Pregnant, far enough along that there was no mistaking it under the blanket. Scarlett stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds before her brain caught up to what her eyes had already told her. She knew that face. Not from a photograph, not from a file. She knew it the way you know your own hand, the shape of the jaw, the small scar above one eyebrow from a bike accident at 11 years old, the exact way the mouth sat even asleep, a little crooked on the left side, the same crooked it had been since they were kids splitting a bag of chips on somebody's porch in Charleston. Audrey, her cousin, her mother's sister's daughter. The girl she'd shared a bedroom with 3 summers running, the one who used to call her at midnight just to talk about nothing, the one who disappeared out of every family group chat, and every Christmas and every single conversation 11 years ago, right around the time the family started saying her name in the past tense, the way people talk about someone who chose to leave and didn't explain why. Nobody had ever said where Audrey went. They'd just stopped saying her name, and here she was, pregnant, asleep, hooked to a monitor in a hospital wing that didn't take walk-ins, under a name on a chart that read Park. Scarlett didn't move. Behind her, Min-suk had finally come to the doorway too, and from the way his breathing changed, she understood, without him saying a single word, that he already knew exactly who she was looking at. They'd been close the way only 2 girls 4 months apart in age can be close, more like sisters who got to pick each other. Audrey used to braid Scarlett's hair too tight on purpose, just to hear her complain. Scarlett used to do Audrey's math homework in exchange for cover when she snuck out. They'd promised, at 15, lying on a trampoline in somebody's backyard, that they'd be in each other's weddings no matter what. Scarlett didn't make it to a wedding. Nobody did. Audrey just stopped showing up, first at family functions, then in phone calls, then in any form at all. The family explanation, repeated enough times that nobody questioned it anymore, was that she'd married into money and decided her old life wasn't worth keeping. People said it with a little bit of judgment baked in, the way people do about someone who can't defend herself in the room. Scarlett's mother used to bring it up at every holiday for the first few years, always the same line. Some people forget where they came from once they think they've found something better. Scarlett never argued with it out loud, mostly because she didn't have anything to argue with. A handful of unanswered texts and one short, oddly formal voicemail wishing the family well wasn't much to build a defense on. She'd stopped expecting an explanation around year 4. By year 7, she'd mostly stopped thinking about it at all, the way people eventually stop checking a wound that's scarred over. Scarlett had believed that story for 11 years. She was standing in a hospital doorway, finding out it was never true. A woman's voice came from behind her, even and unbothered, the kind of voice that had never once had to raise itself to get what it wanted. You shouldn't be in here. Min-suk's mother stood in the hallway in a coat that cost more than Scarlett's rent, looking at the scene in front of her like a logistics problem that had gotten slightly out of hand rather than a family crisis. She didn't ask who Scarlett was. She didn't need to. The math was visible on her face, quick and unsurprised, like she'd already run this scenario before it happened. Her blood pressure's been a concern for weeks, Madam Park said, to her son, not to Scarlett. I told the staff to watch it. They should have called me before it got this far. Watch it where? Scarlett said. She wasn't seeing a doctor? Madam Park looked at her properly for the first time. This isn't your concern. She's my cousin. That landed differently than Scarlett expected it to. Madam Park's expression didn't crack, but it paused. A half-second recalibration. the look of someone doing fast math on information she hadn't accounted for. Her family hasn't been involved in a long time, Madam Park said carefully. Because you made sure of it. I made sure she was provided for. Housing, medical care, security. Most families would call that generous. Most families don't need security to keep someone from leaving. Madam Park's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes recalculated again, filing Scarlett under a different category than the one she'd started the conversation in. Nobody answered that. A nurse passed behind them with a tray, eyes down, the specific kind of not looking that comes from years of being trained not to ask questions in this particular hallway. Scarlett looked back into the room, at the monitor, at the IV, at a woman who'd been kept somewhere quiet enough and controlled enough that her own family didn't know she was 11 years deep into a marriage, 9 months pregnant, and apparently not seeing a regular doctor for blood pressure that had clearly been a problem for longer than weeks. That word sat wrong. People who get proper prenatal care don't end up like this from something that builds slowly enough to track. This wasn't an accident that happened to a family. This was a situation that had been managed, the same way POC Construction managed a failed port inspection, quietly, internally, until it couldn't be contained anymore. A young doctor stepped out of the room a minute later, pulling off a pair of gloves, and made the mistake of answering Scarlett's question before anyone told him not to. She's had elevated readings for at least 2 months, based on the home monitor logs the staff brought in, he said. She should have been seen weekly once it crossed this threshold. There's no record of an OB visit in the last 5 weeks. Whose job was that? Scarlett said. The doctor looked between her and Madam Park, recalculated who he was actually allowed to answer that question in front of, and said nothing else. An assistant appeared at his elbow a second later and walked him back through the door before anyone could ask him anything further. Scarlett had spent enough years watching people cover for each other in board meetings to recognize the shape of that exact move. A staff trained well enough to know precisely which sentence not to finish. Scarlett had spent 3 years learning exactly how this family handled things they didn't want seen. She just hadn't known, until tonight, that one of those things was a person. Madam Park went back into the room to talk to a doctor in low Korean, leaving Min-sok standing in the hallway with nowhere left to put his hands. Scarlett pulled him a few feet further down, out of earshot, the way you move someone before you say something you don't want overheard. How long have you known? She said. Known what? Don't. She kept her voice flat, controlled. The same voice she used in conference rooms when someone tried to slide a bad number past her. How long have you known I was related to her? He looked at the floor. Min-sok. A while, he said. Define a while. Since before you and I. He stopped himself. Started again. Since the 2nd month. There was a security file. My mother runs background on anyone who gets close to the company. Your last name came up flagged because of the family connection. And you didn't say anything. What was I supposed to say? You were supposed to tell me my cousin was alive. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You let my family believe she walked away and didn't look back. You let me believe that too. For 3 years you sat across from me. You knew exactly who I was related to, and you decided that wasn't worth mentioning. It wasn't that simple. It's exactly that simple. She took a step back from him, putting distance between them on purpose. You didn't tell me because telling me would have made this real. Both of us, at the same time, in the same family. That's not an oversight. That's a decision you made every single day for 3 years. He didn't argue with that. That was its own answer too, the 3rd one tonight. She didn't raise her hand to him, though for 1 second the option crossed her mind clean and complete. The way these things do before judgment catches up to impulse. She put both hands in her coat pockets instead, and kept them there, the same trick she used in hostile meetings to stop herself from pointing at anyone. You let me think I was the only complicated thing in your life, she said. Turns out I was the simple part. He flinched at that. The first honest reaction she'd gotten out of him all night. Scarlett, don't say my name like that right now. You don't get to sound sorry yet. Sorry comes after you've told me something true. Does she know about me? Scarlett asked. No. Does she know you have someone? He hesitated just long enough to answer the question without saying a word. She knows, Scarlett said, not as a question anymore. She's never said anything about it. No, we don't. We haven't talked like that in a long time. How long is a long time? A year? Maybe more. Why keep both of us? Scarlett asked. If it's been a year, if there's nothing left with her, why not just end it and tell the truth? Because ending it meant explaining it. To her, to my mother, to the board. I didn't have an answer that didn't make me look like exactly what I am. And lying to me for 3 years felt easier than that. He didn't answer, which by now was its own language between them, the only honest thing he had left to say. Scarlett looked past him, through the door that had drifted half open, at the woman in the bed who'd spent 11 years erased from one family, and apparently most of that time barely present in the one that replaced it. A wife who didn't get doctor's visits. A cousin who didn't get phone calls. A woman managed by people who had decided, separately and for their own reasons, that her comfort wasn't a priority worth disrupting their own. I need to see her records, Scarlett said. What records? Medical, financial. Whatever your mother's people have been filing for the past 11 years to make a person disappear that thoroughly. She was already moving toward the elevator, coat still on, the particular calm of someone who'd just figured out which job she actually had to do tonight. Because either this was negligence, which is bad enough, or somebody let it get this far on purpose, and I think you know which one it is. She didn't wait for him to answer. The elevator doors closed on a hallway that still smelled like antiseptic and expensive perfume, two things that had no business being in the same building. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a handful of cars belonging to people working shifts nobody envied. Scarlett sat in her own car for a full minute before starting the engine, hands steady on the wheel, in a way that surprised her a little. She'd expected to be shaking by now. She wasn't. Whatever was coming, her body had apparently already decided this wasn't the part where she fell apart. She didn't go home that night. She went to the office instead, her own office, 3 floors of a building downtown that had nothing to do with pack construction on paper, everything to do with it in practice. Her badge still worked at 4 in the morning, which told her nobody had thought to revoke it yet. That wouldn't last. She pulled up the files she already had legitimate access to, the subsidiary accounts she'd been auditing for 3 years under the polite fiction of tax efficiency. She knew this company's books the way most people know their own kitchen, where things were, and where things were supposed to be, and where the gap between those two facts usually hid. She started with payroll, not the executive payroll, the smaller account, the one that ran under a property management subsidiary nobody outside the family paid attention to. Domestic staff, private medical contractors, a driver, a security detail that didn't show up on any organizational chart she'd ever been handed. The dates were the first thing that didn't sit right. The earliest entry for private medical staff under that account ran back 12 years. Audrey had only married Min Sook, based on what Scarlett had pieced together from the wedding photo that used to circulate before it stopped circulating, 11 years ago, which meant the infrastructure to manage and monitor her had existed before there was technically anyone to monitor. Scarlett sat back from the screen for a second. That wasn't a family managing a difficult situation as it came up. That was a family that had already decided, in advance, exactly how a particular kind of person would need to be handled once she was brought in. She kept going. A monthly payment, steady, almost boring in its consistency, routed to a private physician's office that didn't take other patients according to the state license database, a single client practice, essentially, built around one person. Another line, smaller, recurring, paid to a security firm for residential monitoring services. Not protection, monitoring. None of it was illegal on its face. People hired private doctors. People hired security. But stacked together, dated the way they were dated, it read like something else entirely. A containment system built before the woman it was meant to contain ever had a say in the matter. She cross-referenced the medical contractor against older entries in the same account, and found a second name buried further back. A different woman, a different set of recurring payments, dated to the 7 years before Audrey's name ever appeared in the system. The payments for that name stopped abruptly. No closing note, no transfer, no record of where the money went after that. Just a hard stop on a Tuesday in March, 11 years ago. The same month, she'd later confirm, Min Sok's private wedding photos first started circulating. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe a contractor had simply changed jobs, and the timing was coincidence. But coincidence wasn't a word Scarlett trusted in a ledger that had already shown her how far in advance this family planned things. Whoever that first name belonged to, Audrey had been brought in afterward to fill whatever role she'd left behind. Scarlett wrote the name down on a separate page, away from the official file, the same way she started every investigation that mattered more than the contract she'd actually been hired for. A little after 3, a security guard doing rounds on her floor stopped outside her open office door, flashlight low, and asked what she was still doing there at that hour. She told him she was finishing a deliverable for a Monday deadline, which was technically true, and watched him decide it wasn't worth the trouble of checking further. She knew the badge logs would tell a different story if anyone with the right access ever bothered to look. A consultant pulling files from accounts well outside the scope of her actual contract, in the middle of the night, the day after a medical emergency involving the family she audited. If this went the way she suspected it might, that log would either make her case or end her career. She kept working anyway. She thought about calling someone, just to say what she'd found out loud to a person who wasn't involved in any of it, and realized somewhere around 4:30 that there wasn't anyone left to call. Not her mother, not her usual friends, not the man she'd have called 8 hours earlier without thinking twice. Whatever she found from here, she was going to be the only one carrying it until she decided who else needed to. Scarlett pulled the marriage certificate next, out of curiosity more than anything, expecting a formality. She didn't find one. Not in any Korean civil registry she had access to cross-reference, and her firm had access to plenty for due diligence purposes. There was a private ceremony, photos, a guest list, family acknowledgement, but no record of the marriage being legally registered with the state, which meant on paper, in the eyes of any government that mattered, Audrey Foster wasn't married at all. Scarlett stared at that for a long time, a woman erased from one family, never legally attached to the other, 9 months pregnant, and as far as any official document was concerned, she didn't formally belong anywhere. That was either the cruelest accident in the world, or it was the entire point. Audrey woke up a little after 10 the next morning with a tube under her nose and a number on a monitor that finally looked like it belonged to a living person. Scarlett was the only one in the room. She'd told the nurse she was family, which, this time, was true. Audrey looked at her for a long moment before she said anything, the kind of look that wasn't confusion so much as recognition arriving slow, piece by piece. Scarlett. Hey, you got old. You got married into a horror movie. That got the smallest laugh out of her, more breath than sound, but real. Then it faded fast, the way laughing does when there's too much underneath it to hold up for long. How long have you known? Audrey asked. Known what part? Any of it. Since last night. Scarlett pulled the chair closer. I didn't know you existed in this family until I walked into this room and saw your face. Audrey nodded slowly, like that tracked with everything else about the last 11 years. They told everyone I left, she said. Did they tell you that too? Yeah. I didn't leave. I got moved. There's a difference. She looked at the IV in her hand, not at Scarlett. First year I tried calling home. His mother had the number changed twice before I figured out it wasn't a coincidence. After a while, it was easier to just stop trying than to keep losing. Why didn't you tell anyone what was happening? Who was I going to tell? I didn't have a passport with my name still active for half of it. I didn't have my own bank account until 4 years in, and even that one, she could see everything that moved through it. Audrey finally looked over. You're the first person in 11 years who showed up because they actually knew me, not because they were assigned to. You remember the trampoline, Audrey said suddenly, behind your mom's old place. You broke your wrist on that thing. You told everyone I broke it, falling off a horse because it sounded better. It sounded more interesting than the truth, which was you and me jumping at the same time like idiots. Audrey almost laughed again, and this time it held a little longer before it faded. I used to think about that trampoline a lot, the first few years. Stupid thing to miss. Not the house, not the people. Just that dumb trampoline and you laughing so hard you couldn't breathe. I missed you for 11 years and didn't even know I was allowed to. That sat between them a second, neither woman moving to fill the space it left. Audrey reached over, slow, and laid her hand on top of Scarlett's on the edge of the bed, careful of the IV line, careful in the way someone is when they're not sure touch is still allowed between them. Scarlett didn't pull away. Thank you for coming. Audrey said. "Even if it took 11 years and a hospital bed to get you here. I'm not going anywhere now." Scarlett didn't have anything to say to that for a second. Then she said the only useful thing she had. "I found something last night. Your marriage isn't registered. Not with the state, not anywhere I can find." Audrey went still in a different way than before. Not surprised, exactly. Like she'd suspected it and was finally hearing it confirmed out loud. "I know," she said. "I found that out 2 years ago. Found a lot of things, actually. Going through papers I wasn't supposed to see." She reached for the small drawer beside the bed, slow, careful of the IV line, and pulled out a folded piece of paper that had clearly been moved and re-hidden more than once. "This is the only thing I managed to keep a copy of without anyone noticing." Scarlett unfolded it. A shareholder agreement, dated 9 years back, signed by Min-suk before any of the legal restructuring his mother put in place afterward. A side agreement, separate from the family trust, naming Audrey Foster, her maiden name, as holding 12% ownership in a logistics subsidiary tied to the larger company, something he must have signed early, before his mother had finished consolidating control, before he understood what handing that kind of paper to someone could mean, once that someone stopped being controllable. "He doesn't know I still have this," Audrey said. "He thinks the original got lost when they moved my things the second year." Scarlett read it twice. 12% wasn't nothing. 12%, paired with everything sitting in the accounts Scarlett had spent the night pulling apart, was leverage neither woman would have had alone. "There's a shareholder gala in 9 days, Scarlett said. "Annual thing, the one where they parade the family out for investors. Your name's never been on the guest list. It's never been allowed to be. It should be this year." The doctor came back before either of them could plan much further than that. She didn't sit down, which told Scarlett most of what she needed to know before she said a word. "Her pressure's still trending the wrong way," she said. "At full term, with numbers like this, waiting isn't the safer option anymore. I'd rather deliver in the next day or two than keep watching it climb." Audrey took that the way she seemed to take everything now. Flat, unsurprised. "Guess we don't have 9 days, she said once she'd gone. "We don't need the gala for the first part," Scarlett said. "I can start moving on the financial exposure now. Quietly, without you anywhere near it. You focus on getting through this. We hit the board together once you're both strong enough to be in that room." Audrey almost smiled. "Look at you, already running the timeline. Someone has to." They induced her the next morning. Scarlett waited 2 floors down with Min-suk, the two of them sharing a row of plastic chairs neither had chosen, watching the same door without speaking for most of an hour. At one point he asked her, quietly, whether she thought Audrey had been afraid. Scarlett told him the truth, that Audrey hadn't looked afraid once since the morning she woke up, not because there was nothing to be afraid of, but because she'd spent 11 years learning how not to let her face show what she was carrying. He didn't have anything to say back to that. Neither did she, after a while. They just sat there, 2 people who'd both loved the same family badly in different ways, waiting on the same news. It went wrong the way these things go wrong when nobody catches it early enough. Fast, technical, almost impossible to see coming from outside a delivery room. A seizure on the table, the kind her body had been building toward for weeks while nobody with the authority to stop it had been watching closely enough. An emergency surgical delivery. A baby pulled out small and furious and breathing on her own within a minute. A mother who never stopped bleeding the way she was supposed to once they tried to close. Scarlett got the call in a waiting room 2 floors down, not from Min-suk, not from his mother, but from a nurse who didn't yet know whose name belonged on which side of this family, and said it plain because nobody had told her not to. The baby made it. Audrey didn't. The funeral was small and fast, the kind of service that read more like a formality than a goodbye. A private chapel, a closed casket, a scattering of POC construction staff, standing in for relatives who hadn't been told the truth in time to make the trip. The flowers were the expensive kind nobody actually likes, white and stiff, and arranged by someone paid to make grief look presentable. Scarlett stood near the back in a plain black dress, a hospital bracelet still on her wrist because nobody had reminded her to take it off, while a nurse a few feet away held a small sleeping bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket, because 4 days in, Nobody had quite figured out yet whose job it was to hold her. Madame Park sat in the front row in black, her chignon as tight as ever, her face arranged into something that could pass for grief from a distance and read as nothing at all up close. Min-sok sat beside her, hollowed out in a way that had stopped looking new. Same posture from the hospital floor. Same posture, Scarlett guessed, he'd carry into every room for the rest of his life. Scarlett didn't approach either of them. She'd learned, over 4 days, exactly how fast that family moved once they'd decided which version of events they wanted on record. A statement to one outlet, framing it as a tragic medical complication, no mention of 5 weeks without a doctor. A burial moved up 2 days earlier than the date given to Scarlett's own mother, who heard about it from a cousin's cousin instead of from anyone who actually knew. And then, 3 days after Audrey died, a filing Scarlett only found because a paralegal at her own firm flagged it by accident while running an unrelated search. An emergency petition for sole guardianship of the child, filed in Min-suk's name, his mother listed as backup guardian if anything happened to him. Scarlett read it twice at the same desk where she'd found the second woman's name in the ledger 5 nights earlier. Min-suk was the baby's biological father. Under the law, that gave him standing nobody could argue away, marriage or no marriage. What the filing didn't say outright, what she had to read across 3 separate paragraphs to understand, was that granting him guardianship also handed his mother effective control over anything that came with the child, including whatever piece of Audrey's estate, and Audrey's 12%, would eventually belong to a daughter too young to know any of this was happening around her. Scarlett didn't have a legal right to stop that filing. She wasn't next of kin in any way a court would recognize. Not the mother, not the father, not a spouse. Just a cousin with a folder full of financial records and a bracelet she hadn't taken off. What she did have was a board meeting already on the calendar for Thursday, the one nobody had bothered to cancel, because canceling it would have meant explaining why. She walked into that room alone. No Audrey beside her this time. No matching dress, no shared leverage standing tall at her shoulder. Just Scarlett, a folder, and 5 nights of records nobody else in that building had read closely enough to understand what they were looking at. The room was smaller than a gala would have been. Plainer, a long table, a dozen men who'd learned a long time ago not to ask questions that might cost them a relationship with the family that signed their checks. Madame Park sat at the head of the table, still in black, like she hadn't changed since the chapel. Scarlett laid it out the way she'd laid out every finding in 11 years of compliance work. Clean, sequenced, impossible to argue with once the numbers were on the table. A containment system built before a marriage existed. A pattern reaching back to a different woman entirely, years before Audrey's name ever entered it. Monthly payments to a single client medical practice. A marriage never legally registered, while the woman inside it went 5 weeks without a doctor at the exact moment her body needed one most. A board member near the front, older, the kind of man who'd spent 30 years protecting his own money before anyone else's, asked the only question that mattered. Was this company aware of the medical risk it was funding? The company paid for it, Scarlett said. Every month, for over a decade. I have the records if anyone wants to see them. She'd brought copies. Madame Park didn't crack the way Scarlett half expected. There was no crowd of investors with their phones half raised. No room to perform for. Just a quiet table and a woman finally understanding, watching the faces around her, that this fight wasn't going to end with her controlling the story. Her voice stayed level. This is a tragedy. It is not a crime. 5 weeks without a doctor at full term isn't a tragedy that happens on its own, Scarlett said. It's a tragedy somebody let happen, on a schedule somebody else was tracking in a spreadsheet. Nobody at that table had an answer for that. A different board member, the youngest one in the room, asked the question Scarlett had been waiting for someone else to ask all morning. Why bring this to us now instead of to the police? Because the police investigate crimes, Scarlett said. I need this board to stop funding one. Those aren't the same fight, and I don't have time to wait for the first one to catch up to the second. The vote, when it came an hour later, wasn't close. Operational control suspended, pending a full independent audit, one Scarlett would not be running herself, on the advice of her own counsel, given her relationship to the deceased, but one that would happen regardless. Madame Park's name came off 3 accounts before the room had finished clearing. Min-suk hadn't said a word the whole hour. He'd stopped being the center of his own story days ago, somewhere between the hospital floor and the chapel, and he understood that better than his mother seemed to. Scarlett found him afterward near the elevators, the kind of leftover man she'd watched him become every time this family needed him out of the room. "I'm sorry," he said. First time in 5 days he'd said it without being asked to explain something first. "I know. What happens now?" "I don't know yet." She meant the company. She also meant the rest of it, the part with no board vote attached to it. She found out an hour later, in the hospital lobby, on her way up to see the baby for the first time since the chapel. A lawyer she didn't recognize fell into step beside her without asking permission. "Miss Bennett, I represent the family in the matter of the guardianship petition," he said. "I want to be transparent early, so there's no confusion later. As the child's biological father, Mr. Park has standing, the court will almost certainly recognize without much difficulty. As a cousin of the deceased, you'd need to formally petition for any standing at all, and even then, courts favor a surviving parent, absent clear evidence of unfitness. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what's actually achievable here before this turns adversarial. Is that a threat or a courtesy?" "It's accurate information," he said, and left it at that. Scarlett didn't argue with him in the lobby. There was nothing to argue yet, just a piece of paper somewhere, with a judge's name on it, who hadn't ruled on anything. Scarlett rode the elevator up alone. The hospital was quiet at this hour, the kind of quiet that had started to feel less like peace and more like the specific silence this family seemed to leave behind everywhere it went. Through the nursery window, a nurse held up a small bundle wrapped in a pale blue blanket, dark hair already thick on a head no bigger than 2 fists pressed together. For 1 second, the only thing in the world that mattered was that small, furious, breathing weight none of them had managed to protect in time to save her mother. The financial fight, Scarlett understood now, watching through the glass, had been the easy one. This one was just getting started. If this ending hit you, let me know in the comments, and tell me what you think about this story. Like this video, and subscribe if you're new here. Thank you.